He was handed a prophecy he meant to cheat, and never knew the human heart cannot counterfeit love without, in the end, minting the real thing. Some lies become the only truth you'll ever own. We begin our story now. The owl came at the hour when the manor was at its emptiest, when the long galleries held nothing but the cold breath of marble, and the portraits had gone to sleep behind their gilded frames. Draco Malfoy stood at the tall window of the eastern study, a tumbler of fire whiskey untouched at his elbow, watching the December dusk drain the colour from the gardens. The yews had gone black against a sky the shade of a bruise. Somewhere below, a peacock, one of the last of his father's absurd birds, gave a cry that sounded almost human, almost grieving, and then fell silent. He was 24 years old, and he had not spoken aloud to another living soul in 3 days. This was how he preferred it now. The war had left him with a horror of being looked at. In the corridors of the ministry, where he went twice a week to sign the reparations documents that bound the Malfoy fortune to the rebuilding of a world his family had tried to burn, he kept his eyes on the middle distance and his collar high. People still flinched from the pale length of his left forearm, even though the mark had faded to a grey scar, a thing like old smoke under the skin. He had learned to wear gloves. The owl was not his. He knew that before it reached the glass. A great, tawny thing, storm-battered, with eyes like 2 drops of amber and a parchment bound to its leg, with a ribbon the precise green of a serpent's belly. It struck the window once, twice, the soft thud of feathers against leaded panes, and Draco felt something cold articulate itself along the base of his spine before he had any reason for it. He let the bird in. The study filled with the smell of rain and the faint mineral tang of a creature that had flown a long way through a coming storm. The parchment was old, not made to look old. Old, the way the deeds in the vault were old, the surface gone soft and napped as swede, the edges feathered where 100 years of handling had worn them. When he broke the seal, a fine grey dust sifted onto his fingers, and he had the irrational sense that he was disturbing something that ought to have stayed asleep. The hand was not modern. The ink had the brownish cast of iron gall gone to rust with the centuries. To the last of the unbroken line it began, and Draco's mouth went dry, because the Malfoys had always known what they were. The unbroken line, the pure descent, the thing his father had wept over in his cups after the trials, when there was nothing left of the family's honour but the word itself. He read it, standing up. He read it twice. A prophecy, the letter said, recorded in the Department of Mysteries, sealed for reasons of blood, and released now by the operation of certain charms, keyed to a name and a season, and a turning of years. The unspeakables were obliged by law to surrender such things to the subject of them. Draco's eyes moved down the page, and the words arranged themselves, and rearranged themselves, and refused, for a long moment, to mean anything at all. From the blood of the last grey sun shall come the heir of Slytherin's house, the one who closes what was opened, who wakes the sleeping thing in the deep, and the mother of him shall be born of those the line names lowest, of the unmagicked blood the house most despised. So shall the serpent come again into its inheritance. Yet the thread may be cut, and the heir unmade, if the grey sun cannot master what is in him? For it is written that only through the conquering of his own nature, the surrender of the thing he holds most fiercely, can the prophecy fail to come to pass. There was more. Names dressed in old kennings, the grammar of a tongue half Latin and half something older. But Draco had stopped reading. The tumbler of fire whiskey stood at his elbow, and he watched with a strange detachment his own hand reach for it, watched the amber liquid tremble against the crystal, ring after ring shivering outward, and understood from this small betrayal that his hand was not steady. A mudblood. The words surfaced in him out of old habit, ugly and reflexive, and he did not stop it. There was no one to hear. From the blood of a Malfoy and the womb of a Muggle-born would come. What? An heir of Slytherin. The line of Salazar himself, the line that had run thin and then run out, the line for which his great-grandfather had kept a portrait in the cellar and bowed to it. And it would come through the very contamination his whole childhood had been built to abhor. He set the glass down without drinking. The cruelty of it was so exact, so personally tailored, that for one wild instant he suspected a hex, that someone had crafted this expressly to torment him, knowing the shape of the things he hated. But the parchment was genuine. He could feel the age of it, the way one feels the depth of cold water before stepping in. The ministry seal was genuine. The dread that had walked up his spine when the owl first struck the glass had been genuine too, the body knowing before the mind would let it. He crossed to the fire and stood very close to it, close enough that the heat pressed against his face like a hand, and he read the final lines again. The thread may be cut, the heir unmade. If the grey sun cannot master what is in him, most men, receiving such a thing, would have felt themselves cursed. Draco, in the firelight, with the rain beginning now in earnest against the eastern windows, felt the slow uncoiling of something he had not expected, a terrible, vertiginous freedom. Because the prophecy told him how to defeat it, the surrender of the thing he holds most fiercely. He held his pride most fiercely. Everyone knew this. He knew it best of all. And the prophecy assumed, its whole architecture assumed, that the way out lay in yielding, in some grand softening, in becoming a man who could love a Muggle-born woman and make with her a child got in tenderness. That was the test. Conquer your nature. Surrender. Bend. But there was another way to read it. There was always another way to read it, with prophecies. His aunt had said so once, in that singing voice that had made his skin crawl. They are riddles, Draco, and riddles are made to be cheated. What if he did not yield at all? What if he gave the prophecy exactly what it asked for? The child, the Muggle-born mother, the union of the two bloods, and yielded nothing? What if he kept his nature whole and hard inside him, untouched, and merely performed the surrender? Courted the woman, won her, got the child, and then walked away, having loved nothing, having surrendered nothing, having proved the prophecy a fool. Let it have its air of Slytherin if it must. Let the serpent come again into its inheritance. He would have authored it himself by his own cold will, with not 1 inch of his pride conceded. And a prophecy that could be used like a tool was no master of any man. It was monstrous. He knew that it was monstrous even as the architecture of it assembled itself in his mind, beam by beam, with the terrible clarity that came to him only in his worst hours. It would require him to take a woman's heart in his hands and counterfeit a love he did not feel, and then to set that heart down, broken, and leave. It would require a child made not in tenderness, but in stratagem, the most intimate act in the world turned into a long, patient lie. He thought, distantly, that he ought to feel revulsion at himself. He waited for it. The fire snapped. The rain ran in cords down the black glass. The peacock cried again, far off, and was answered by nothing. The revulsion did not come. What came instead was the old, familiar coldness, the thing the war had grown in him like a second spine, the capacity to do a necessary, hateful thing and watch himself do it from somewhere just behind his own eyes. He had carried a dark mark at 16 because he had been told he must. He had let Death Eaters into this house. He had lowered his wand on the tower because he could not, in the end, become the thing they wanted. And that single failure of nerve had cost him everything and saved his soul in the same instant. He did not, any longer, trust his own sense of what he could and could not do. And there was this, too, which he admitted only to the fire. The prophecy had named a woman without naming her, and there was only one woman in the world whom the line named lowest, whom the house had most despised, who would close the loop of his old hatreds with the precision of a key fitting a lock. He had grown up despising her by name. He had watched her be brilliant in 100 lessons while he told himself she was nothing. He had watched his aunt carve a slur into her arm on the drawing-room floor of this very house, while he stood against the wall and did not move, and did not move, and did not move. Granger. The name went through him like a wire drawn tight. She worked at the ministry now. Everyone knew it. She was famous. She had remade half the statutes governing the rights of magical creatures, and she was, even now, he had heard, attached to the very office of post-war reconstruction, whose papers he came twice a week to sign. He could engineer a proximity without lifting a finger that would look like effort. The world had already arranged them in the same building. He had only to stop avoiding her. He thought of her face, the last time he had truly looked at it, in the chaos of the final battle, smeared with ash and blood, and a ferocity that had frightened him more than any curse. He felt the old contempt rise, comfortable as a worn coat, and he wrapped it around himself, and he told himself, "This is the proof I will not soften. I despise her now, and I will despise her on the day the child is born, and I will despise her on the day I leave, and the prophecy will break itself against the wall of what I am." He did not yet know that a man cannot wear a coat for long without growing warm beneath it. He did not yet know that the human heart, asked to counterfeit a feeling night after night, will sometimes, out of sheer exhaustion, out of proximity, out of the body's stubborn honesty, begin to mint the genuine coin. He did not know that he had just designed the instrument of his own undoing and signed his name to it. He knew only that the fire was warm and the rain was cold, and that somewhere in London a woman with ash-coloured eyes and a scar on her arm was very likely working late, bent over her papers in the lamplight, with no notion at all that the last of the grey line had just decided, in a manner full of sleeping portraits, to make her love him. Draco folded the parchment along its ancient creases. He slid it into the breast of his robes, against his heart, where it would stay. Then he reached again for the fire whiskey, and this time, when he lifted the glass, his hand had stopped shaking. And that steadiness, he would think much later, was the first lie of all the lies to come, the lie his own body told him to make the rest of them possible. The Ministry of Magic, in the third winter after the war, was a place still learning how to breathe. They had rebuilt the atrium in haste, and then, ashamed of the haste, rebuilt it again more slowly. The fountain that had once glorified wizard-kind above all other creatures was gone, and in its place stood a thing of plain dark stone over which water moved without ornament, without statuary, without a single triumphant figure. People said it was meant to signify humility. Draco thought it signified that no one had been able to agree on what to put there, which amounted, in the end, to the same thing. He came on Tuesdays. He had always come on Tuesdays, in the dull grey hour after the morning rush had thinned, when the lifts no longer disgorged their crowds, and a man could move through the lower levels without gathering stairs like burrs. The reparations papers waited for him in the Office of Post-War Reconstruction on Level 2, a stack renewed each week as fresh tracts of the fortune were prized loose and apportioned to the families of the dead, to the rebuilding of Diagon Alley, to the school. He signed them with a self-inking quill that the clerk had once handed him with a curl of the lip, as though even the quill ought to despise the hand that held it. For 3 years he had signed and left. He had never once gone looking for the door at the end of the corridor, the one with the small brass plate that read H.J. Granger. Magical equity and reconstruction, though he had known it was there the way one knows the location of an old wound even with the eyes shut. This Tuesday he went looking. He had spent the week in preparation, and the preparation had disgusted and absorbed him in equal measure, the way the planning of any campaign absorbs the soldier who does not want to fight it. He had thought about her as one thinks about terrain. She was clever, cleverer than he was. He conceded to the fire each night, and the concession cost him less than he expected. She was suspicious by temperament and by experience. She had survived a war by trusting almost no one, and she would not be charmed by anything that announced itself as charm. A direct approach would fail. A warm one would fail faster. She would read warmth from him as the ploy it was, and she would be right, and her being right would close the door for good. So he would not be warm. He would be honest, or wear the costume of it, which was better, because honesty was the one thing she would not expect from a Malfoy, and the unexpected was the only crack in any wall. He found her not in her office, but in the long records hall on Level 2, a vaulted chamber where the post-war archives were kept in their thousands, shelf upon shelf receding into a brown gloom that smelled of dust and tallow, and the particular dry sweetness of old parchment going slowly to powder. She was alone. She stood on the third rung of a sliding ladder with a folio open against her forearm, and a quill held crosswise in her teeth, and a frown of pure concentration that he recognized across 8 years, and the whole width of the room, because it was the same frown she had worn over every book, in every lesson he had ever resented her for understanding before he did. He stopped in the doorway. He had meant to speak at once. Instead, For the space of 3 breaths, he only watched her, and he was annoyed to find the watching was not entirely strategy. She had changed. Of course she had changed. They all had. The war had taken the roundness from their faces and put something harder underneath. But it had done something to her he had not anticipated. The girl he remembered had been all forward motion, hand always first in the air, voice always pushing into the room. The woman on the ladder was still in a way that girl had never been. A stillness with weight to it, a person who had learned the value of saying nothing, of waiting, of letting the silence do work. Her hair, which had been a famous wildness, was bound back now. Those strands of it had escaped to lie against a neck that the lamplight made the colour of weak tea. There was a thinness to her wrists. There was a single line drawn fine between her brows that had not been there when she was 17, and that would, he understood, never entirely leave now. She felt him before she saw him. He watched it happen. The small change in the set of her shoulders, the way her hand went still on the folio. When she turned her head and found him in the doorway, the quill came out of her teeth in one quick movement, and her whole body recomposed itself into something braced. Malfoy! His name in her mouth was flat, careful, a stone laid down rather than spoken. You're lost. The signing office is the other way. I know where the signing office is. He did not move from the doorway. He had decided he would not advance. He would let her decide the distance, every inch of it, because a person who is granted the control of distance will spend it more freely than one from whom it is taken. I've come from there. I wanted to ask you something, and I find I'd rather ask it to your face than send an owl. She came down the ladder. She did it without haste, and without taking her eyes off him, one rung at a time, the way one descends in the presence of an animal one does not yet trust not to spring. When her feet were on the floor, she set the folio on a reading table between them, and the table's presence, there was not an accident. He understood that she had put a barrier in the room and meant it to stay. Ask, then. He had rehearsed a dozen openings. He discarded all of them in the instant because she was looking at him with those ash-grey eyes that had always seen too much, and the rehearsed thing would die in the air between them. The reconstruction of the Pembroke holdings, he said instead. The Muggle-born resettlement claims. Your office is administering them, and my estate is funding 1/3 of them, and the figures don't reconcile. I've been signing papers for 3 years that I'm increasingly certain are wrong. Someone in this building is skimming the resettlement fund and dressing the theft as administrative cost, and the only person whose name I trust on the audits is yours. He paused. I'd like your help proving it. That's all. That's the whole of why I came. It was true. That was the elegance of it, the thing he had spent the week building. It was true. There was a thief in the resettlement fund. He had found the discrepancy himself 3 weeks ago, in the small hours when sleep would not come. And he had recognized it at once as the lever he needed. A real wrong she would care about, a thing he could ask her to do at his side that touched the very people the war had cost the most. He did not have to manufacture a pretext. He had only to bring her a true one and let it do the work a lie could never do. He watched her receive it. He watched the suspicion stay exactly where it was. She did not believe him, not for a moment, not the part where he said he trusted her name. But he watched something else move underneath the suspicion, a smaller, harder thing, the thing in her that had never in her life been able to leave an injustice unexamined once it had been named in front of her. "Why would you care," she said slowly, "if Muggle-borns are being cheated of their resettlement money?" There it was, the question that was the whole war in 9 words. He had known it would come, and he had decided in the long planning that the only answer that would not detonate in his face was the worst one, the true one, the one that cost him. "I don't know that I do care," Draco said. "Not the way you mean it. I'm not going to stand here and tell you the war made a good man of me, because you'd hear the falseness in it before I finished, and you'd be right to." His voice was very level. He had made it level by an act of will, the way one holds a hand steady over a flame. "But someone is stealing, and they're using my money to do it, and my name is on every document that launders the theft. I find I object to that. Call it pride, if you want. You've always thought my pride was the worst thing about me." He let a beat fall. Perhaps for once it can be put to some use. She did not answer at once. She picked up the quill from the table and turned it over in her fingers, once, twice, and he saw, because he had trained himself this week to see, that the turning of the quill was the thing her hands did when her mind was racing, the small mechanical motion that bought her the seconds she needed. He filed it away. He filed everything away. "You expect me to believe," she said, "that Draco Malfoy walked the length of level 2 to volunteer himself for an audit that will embarrass someone in this ministry out of pride. I expect you to believe nothing." He almost smiled, and did not. A smile would have been a tell, and she would have read it. "I expect you to look at the figures, because you can't help yourself, and find that I'm right, because I am. The believing can come later or not at all. I don't need you to think well of me, Granger. I need you to think clearly, and you've always done that better than anyone I've ever met, even when I'd have died before saying so." The compliment landed where he had aimed it, not at her vanity, which had no purchase, but at the single fact about herself she had never doubted and never would. He saw it strike. He saw her decide, against every instinct, that the work mattered more than the man who had brought it, and that she could hold both truths at once. That he was almost certainly playing some game she could not yet see, and that the theft was real, and the people robbed by it were real, and she would not let her distrust of him become their second injury. "Leave the figures," she said at last. "All of them. 3 years' worth. On my desk by Thursday. I'll look." Her chin lifted a fraction. "And understand me, Malfoy. If I find that you're the thief, if this is some elaborate way of getting me to sign off on your own embezzlement, I will see you in front of the Wizengamot myself, and I will enjoy it. I've had a great deal of practice being underestimated by men who thought charm was a substitute for honesty. You won't be the first I've buried. I'd expect nothing less." He inclined his head, the precise degree of a man acknowledging a worthy adversary, and not 1 inch more. Thursday. He turned to go. He had what he had come for. Not her trust, which would have been worthless got so cheaply, but her attention, the engagement of that relentless mind on a problem that would require them to sit in rooms together for weeks. He had the door open now. he had only to keep walking through it. He was 3 steps into the corridor when she spoke again, and her voice had changed. The courtroom edge had gone out of it, and what was left underneath was quieter and more dangerous to him than any threat, because it was the voice of a person genuinely asking. "Malfoy." He stopped. He did not turn. "The last time I was in a room with your family, your aunt was carving a word into my arm, and you were standing against the wall. You didn't help her, but you didn't help me either. You just watched." A pause, and the dust hung in the lamplight, and somewhere far off in the building, a lift gate clashed shut. "Whatever this is, whatever you actually want, I want you to know that I remember that. I remember exactly where you stood." He stood in the corridor with his back to her, and the scar of the mark cold under his glove, and the old parchment of the prophecy folded against his heart. And he found, to his complete astonishment, that he could not produce a single word, that the cold thing he wore like a second spine had, for one unguarded instant, failed him utterly, and that the silence stretching out between his turned back and her steady waiting was the most honest exchange the two of them had ever had. The figures were worse than he had told her. He learned this from her, which was itself a kind of defeat, that she had found in 3 days what he had circled for 3 weeks, the thread that unspooled the whole tapestry. She had laid the ledgers across her office floor in a great fan, waited at the corners with a teacup and an inkwell, and a brass paperweight shaped like an otter, and she walked among them in her stocking feet, having abandoned her shoes somewhere under the desk, and she did not look up when he came in. "Sit," she said. "Don't speak yet. You'll break my count." He sat. He had come on a Thursday that had become a Tuesday, that had become no particular day at all, the audit having devoured the calendar between them. 3 weeks now. He had a chair in her office, an actual chair, which had migrated by slow degrees from the wall to the near side of her desk, without either of them remarking on it. And he found he knew the room the way one knows a room one has begun, against all intention, to inhabit. The cold draught from the enchanted window that showed a weather it invented. The smell of her tea, which was always over-steeped and always going cold untouched while she worked. The way the lamplight at this hour came in low and turned the loose strands at her temple to filaments of copper. He noticed these things and told himself he noticed them as a hunter notices the habits of his quarry. The lie had grown so smooth in his mouth that he no longer heard it as a lie. "Here." She crossed the fan of ledgers and crouched beside one, her finger landing on a column. "And here, and here. Do you see it now?" He came to crouch beside her. The floor was the only place to read them, and she did not move away, which he noted, and the noting did something inconvenient to his pulse, which he did not note or refused to. "It isn't one thief, Malfoy. It's a structure. The skim is built into the forms. Whoever did this didn't steal from the fund. They designed the fund to leak from the first statute 3 years ago when the resettlement office was founded. Every honest clerk who's processed a claim since has been an unwitting part of it. That's why no single audit ever caught it. There's no thief to catch. There's an architecture." He was very close to her. He could see the fine line between her brows drawn taut with the pleasure of the solved thing. And underneath the pleasure, the slow gathering anger, because the solved thing was an obscenity. A machine built to rob the dispossessed, running quietly for 3 years, while widows filed claims that were lightened on their way to nothing. "Then we don't catch a person," he said. "We tear out the architecture." "We." She turned her head, and they were close enough now that he felt the word against his face, rather than only hearing it. Her eyes moved over him, slow, frank, the way she read a document she suspected of forgery. "You keep saying we. 3 weeks ago, you told me you didn't need me to think well of you. You've stopped saying that. You've stopped looking for the trap." It came out before he had vetted it, and he heard the truth in it the way one hears a wrong note. Too late, already played. She had stopped looking for the trap. Somewhere in the last fortnight, bent together over the rot in the resettlement forms, she had begun handing him pages without checking what was on them first, had begun thinking aloud in his presence, he had watched it happen and told himself it was the campaign succeeding. To trust him in the small ways that are the only ways trust is ever really built. The passing of a quill, the unguarded thought, the shoes left off across the room. The campaign was succeeding. That was what he told himself, crouched on her office floor in the low copper light. The campaign was succeeding exactly as designed. So he could not account for what he did next, which was not in any design. A strand of her hair had come loose entirely and fallen across the column she was reading, and she blew at it twice, an irritable upward puff that did nothing, her hands being full of ledger. And Draco reached out. He would replay this 1,000 times and never find the order he had given his own hand, and tucked it back behind her ear. His fingers grazed the shell of her ear and the warm skin behind it, and the contact lasted no longer than a heartbeat, and the air in the room changed as though a window had been opened onto a storm. She went absolutely still. He went absolutely still. The brass otter held down its corner of the ledger, and the invented weather muttered at the false window, and neither of them breathed. It was the wrong move. It was catastrophically the wrong move. Too soon, too tender. A gesture that announced exactly the thing he was supposed to be building toward by slow degrees over months. And he had spent it here on a floor over a column of stolen figures for no reason of strategy at all, because her hair had been in her eyes and his hand had simply gone. He waited for her to recoil. He had earned the recoil. He half wanted it, because the recoil would restore the architecture of the thing, would put the table back between them, would make this a campaign again, instead of whatever it had been for the duration of that single grazing touch. She did not recoil. She looked at him, and her hand came up, slowly, slowly, as though her own hand surprised her too, and her fingers closed around his wrist where it had not yet fully withdrawn, and she did not pull it away, and she did not press it back. She simply held it there in the air between them, his wrist in her hand, the silver of his signet ring biting cold against the warmth of her palm. And she looked at him with a question in her face that had no words attached to it yet, and might never find them. "Don't," she said. The single syllable carried no force at all. It was not a command. It was nearer to a plea, and the plea was not "don't touch me." It was something far more frightening, and they both heard the other thing folded inside it. The "don't make me want this. Don't make this real. Don't be the thing I cannot afford for you to be." He should have said something cold. He had 100 cold things, and any one of them would have served. Instead, he said nothing, because the cold thing he wore like a second spine had failed him for the second time in 3 weeks, and the silence stretched until it became unbearable, and then went past unbearable into something almost sweet. Her hand around his wrist, the ledgers fanned around them like the petals of some monstrous flower, the otter holding down its corner. It was she who broke it. She released his wrist as one sets down something hot, and she rose in a single motion and crossed to the window and stood with her back to him, her arms folded, looking out at weather that did not exist. "We'll draft the amendment tonight," she said to the glass, and her voice had been hammered flat again, every dent worked out of it. "The statute has to be rewritten from the founding clause, or the leak just reopens. It'll take hours. You can go home if you'd rather. I work better alone." "You work better with someone to argue against," he said. "You always have. You used to argue with Weasley until he agreed with you just to make it stop. I'd be insulted to be a worse opponent than Weasley." She made a sound that was almost a laugh and turned it into a cough, and he saw her shoulders come down a fraction from where they had climbed, and he understood that he had said the right thing, and he understood, with a small interior lurch, that he had not said it as strategy, that he had said it to make her almost laugh, to take the rigidity out of her spine, because he had not liked the sight of her braced against the window, with her arms folded over herself like a person guarding a wound. "That is a problem," said the cold voice, far back, the voice that had designed all of this. "You are forgetting which of you is the quarry." He sat back down in the chair that had migrated to her desk. He told the cold voice it was right, and he resolved to be more careful, and within the hour he had forgotten the resolution entirely because they were arguing. They argued the way he had not argued with anyone since the war. Not the deadly arguing of those years, the kind where a wrong word cost a life, but the old kind, the schoolroom kind, the kind where two quick minds strike against each other for the pleasure of the spark. She wanted the amendment broad. He wanted it narrow. She said broad would protect more claimants, and he said broad would be struck down by the Wizengamot's old guard before it ever protected anyone. And she said, since when did he care what survived the Wizengamot? And he said, since he had spent 3 years watching good intentions die in committee for want of a single clever clause. And she stopped, the quill suspended over the parchment, and looked at him as though she had found a window in a wall she had thought was solid. "That's actually right," she said, and the surprise in it was unflattering and entirely sincere, and it pleased him more than any flattery he had ever been paid. They wrote it narrow. They wrote it together, his hand and hers passing the single quill back and forth across the desk, because there was only the one good quill, and neither would use the office's scratching spares. And the lamp burned down, and the invented window cycled through a false midnight. And at some point, she had pulled her chair around to his side of the desk so they could both see the page. And at some point after that, her shoulder was against his shoulder, and neither of them had moved it away. He was aware of the warmth of her shoulder through 2 layers of wool with a precision that alarmed him. He was aware that she had stopped over-steeping her tea hours ago and had not made a fresh pot, that she was running on the work alone now, that there was ink on the side of her hand, and a smudge of it transferred somehow to her cheekbone, that when she reached a difficult clause, she pressed her lips together and her breathing changed, and that he had begun, without deciding to anticipate the changes in her breathing, to know a half-second before she did that she had hit a snag, to have the counter-clause ready in his mouth before she had finished raising the objection. This was not knowing one's quarry. He understood that dimly, somewhere under the work. One did not learn an enemy's breathing. One learned a person's breathing only by wanting, at some level beneath the wanting's own knowledge, to be near enough to hear it. When the amendment was finished, it was past 3 in the morning, and the false window had given up inventing weather and showed only a flat, starless dark. And Hermione Granger fell asleep in the chair beside his, with her ink-stained hand still resting on the last page, her head tipped against the wing of the chair, the line between her brows gone smooth at last. Draco did not wake her. He sat very still, so as not to wake her, and he looked at her sleeping face in the dying lamplight for a long time, longer than any strategy could account for, longer than he would ever admit to the fire or to himself. And the prophecy lay folded against his heart, and for the first time since the owl had struck his window in December, he could not entirely remember why he had been so certain that what he felt for this woman was hatred, and the not remembering frightened him more than anything had frightened him since the war. The amendment passed the Wizengamot on a grey afternoon in February, and that evening, for the first time, they left the building together. Neither had proposed it. The vote had come down in their favour by a margin nobody had predicted. The narrow clause Draco had insisted upon had given the old guard nothing to bite, exactly as he'd promised. And Hermione had turned to him in the gallery with her face lit by a fierceness he had only ever seen her wear in war, except that this time the fierceness was joy, and she had gripped his forearm, the left one, the marked one, without thinking, and he had not pulled it away. They had walked out through the rebuilt atrium past the plain dark fountain, and the cold London night had taken them in. And somehow they were standing on the wet pavement of a side street in Westminster, with the lamps making long gold smears on the slick stones, and neither of them had said good night. "I'm not going home yet," she said. "I can't. I'm too." She gestured, an inarticulate flick of the hand that took in the whole shining street. "There's a place. It's Muggle. They won't know either of us. A beat. You'll hate it. Then I'll hate it," he said, "and you'll enjoy that, and the evening won't be a total loss for one of us." It was a small room below the level of the street, low-ceilinged and warm, with candles guttering in the necks of old wine bottles, so that the wax had grown down them in long pale stalactites, and a fire of actual coal, and the close brown smell of 100 winters' wood smoke soaked into the beams. The Muggles around them paid them no attention at all. This was the thing he had not anticipated, the sheer relief of being unobserved, of sitting in a room where no one knew that one of them was the brightest witch of the age, and the other the last grey son of a disgraced house, where they were only a man and a woman come in out of the cold. She ordered wine, and he let her, because he did not know how to do it here, and he watched her order it with the easy competence of someone moving through her parents' world. And he understood with a small shock that this was her country, the Muggle country, the one his whole childhood had taught him to despise as beneath him. He had despised it without ever once setting foot in it. He sat in the low, warm room with the candle stalactites and the coal fire, and he could find, search as he might, nothing in it to despise. "You're quiet," she said. "You're never quiet. It's unnerving. Say something cutting so I know you haven't been replaced by a changeling." "I was thinking," Draco said, "that I have spent 24 years being certain about a great many things I had never actually examined." He turned the wine glass by its stem, watching the candlelight move in the dark of it. "It's a humbling discovery to make at my age. I'd recommend against it." She went still across the small table. He had not meant to say it. He had meant to say something cutting, as instructed, to keep the surface of the evening light and skating and safe. But the warm room had loosened something in him, and the true thing had come out instead of the armoured one, and now it sat on the table between them, next to the guttering candle, and could not be taken back. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," she said slowly. "In 8 years. Don't grow used to it." But the deflection was soft, and they both heard that it was soft. She looked at him for a long moment over the candle flame, and the firelight moved on her face, and the line between her brows was not anger now, but something more searching, and he had the sudden vertiginous sense that she was about to ask him the question. The real one, the one under all the others. "What do you actually want from me, Draco Malfoy?" And that if she asked it now, here, in this warm Muggle room with the wine and the coal fire, and his guard so thoroughly down, he might answer it, and the answer might be the truth. And the truth would either be the lie he had come with, or some new thing he had not authorized. And he did not know any longer which of those frightened him more. She did not ask it. She did something worse. She told him a true thing of her own. "I haven't slept properly since the war," she said. She said it to the candle, not to him, as though confessing it to the flame were easier than to a face. 3 years. People assume the nightmares are about the battle, curses, the dying, all of that. They're not. I dream about your house." He went cold and still, and she did not look up. "The drawing room, the floor, your aunt's voice. I dream about it more than I dream about anything that happened after, and I think it's because—" Her hand had found the cuff of her left sleeve and was worrying it, turning the button, an unconscious, frantic motion entirely at odds with the level of her voice. "It's because, in the battle, I was fighting. I had a wand. I could do something. On your floor, I couldn't do anything at all. I just lay there and screamed, and your aunt laughed, and the worst part, the part I dream." Now she did look up, and her eyes had a terrible clarity. "Isn't the knife. It's you. Against the wall. Your face. Because I kept thinking, even then, even with the knife, he could stop this. He won't, but he could. And you didn't. And I have spent 3 years trying to understand the kind of person who could stand against a wall and watch that and do nothing. And tonight I sat in a Wizengamot gallery and watched that same person fight for 2 hours to keep 100 Muggle-born widows from being robbed, and I cannot." Her voice cracked, finally, on the last of it. "I cannot reconcile the two of you, and it is keeping me awake worse than the nightmares ever did. And I would like you to explain yourself, because I am too tired to keep doing it for you." The coal fire hissed. Somewhere a Muggle laughed at a Muggle joke. Draco Malfoy sat with his hands flat on the scarred wood of the table to keep them from doing anything. And he understood that this was the moment the entire campaign had been built to reach. Her heart open on the table, defended by nothing, asking to be either healed or broken, and that the strategist far back in his mind was telling him precisely what to say, the warm, exonerating lie that would close the distance and win her utterly and serve the design. He did not say it. "There is no reconciling them," he said instead, and his voice was very low, and it was not steady, and he let it not be steady. "I want to give you the version where the boy against the wall was secretly good, secretly suffering, secretly on your side. It would be easier for both of us. It would also be a lie, and you'd hear it, and I find I'd rather you hate me truly than forgive me falsely." He made himself hold her eyes. "I stood against the wall because I was a coward, Granger, not a conflicted hero. A coward. I was 16, and I was terrified of my aunt, and more terrified of my father, and most terrified of the thing I could feel myself becoming. And I did the thing cowards do, which is nothing. There's no nobler shape to put on it. You lay on my floor and screamed, and I let you, because I was afraid. And being afraid is not an excuse. It is only the reason, and the two are not the same, and I have learned not to confuse them." He stopped. The candle had burned down to a stub. "You asked me to explain myself. That's the explanation. It isn't a good one. I don't have a good one. I'm not sure a good one exists." She was crying. Not loudly. 2 tears tracking down through the candlelight, which she did not wipe away, as though wiping them would be a concession she was not prepared to make. And he wanted, with a force that arrived without warning and took the breath out of him, to reach across the table and wipe them away himself, to take that tired, fierce, sleepless face in both his hands. And the wanting had nothing of strategy in it, nothing at all. It was the simple animal want of one person to ease the pain of another, and it terrified him so completely that he had to grip the edge of the table to keep his hands where they were. "That's it," she said at last, wonderingly through the tears. "That's what I couldn't get. Everyone else who hurt me in that war either thinks they were right or has decided they were secretly good all along. You're the only one who's just sorry, and not even sorry in a way that asks me for anything." She laughed, wetly, disbelievingly. "God, I think I might actually be able to sleep tonight, after 3 years, and it's your fault, which is the most insulting possible outcome." He should have felt triumph. The design said this was triumph. The wall breached, the trust given, the heart opened. He waited for the cold satisfaction of the strategist. What came instead, sitting in the warm low room with a dead candle and the woman crying with relief across from him, was a wave of self-loathing so total and so sudden that he had to look down at the table because he could not have her see his face. She thought his honesty had healed her, and it had. But the honesty had been honest, and the man speaking it had still, even while speaking it, been working a design to take her heart and her body and her child and then leave her. And the fact that the honesty was real did not redeem the design. It made the design worse, because now the kindness was real too, and she would build her recovery on a foundation that he intended, from the first, to walk away from. For the first time since December, Draco Malfoy understood that the prophecy had not given him a way to cheat fate without surrendering anything. It had given him a way to surrender everything by inches without noticing he was doing it, and that he had already surrendered more than he had ever meant to, sitting in a Muggle wine cellar, watching a woman he was supposed to despise fall, with relief and against all sense, into something dangerously close to trust. "It's late," he said roughly, standing, because if he stayed 1 minute longer, he was going to say a thing he could not unsay. "You should sleep while you can. I'll see you Tuesday." Draco. It was the first time she had used his given name, and it stopped him as surely as a hand on his chest. And he stood there in the candlelight, unable to move, while she looked up at him with her face still wet and something newly unguarded in it, and the whole warm room seemed to hold its breath around the single syllable of his name in her mouth. Spring came late that year, and it came to the manor first as a softening, the iron ground giving, the black yews showing at their tips, a green so dark it was nearly the colour of the old leaves, the peacocks growing bold again across lawns that had begun, after 3 years of neglect, to forget the shape a Malfoy garden was supposed to keep. She came to the manor in April. He had not meant to bring her there. He had sworn privately that he never would, that whatever this had become, the house would stay outside it, the house with its drawing room and its floor and its memory of his aunt's laughter, the house she dreamed about. But she had asked. That was the thing he could not have foreseen, that she would ask to come, deliberately, with her jaw set, the way she did everything she was afraid of. "I want to see it awake," she had said. "I only know it in the dark. I want to see the room in the daylight, with you standing in it, and I want to find out whether it's still the worst place in the world or whether it's just a room. I can't do it alone, and I won't do it with anyone else. So," a breath, "will you?" He had said yes because he could not say no to her, and he had stopped pretending by then that this was strategy. She walked the drawing room in the long April light with her hands clasped behind her back, slowly, the way she walked among ledgers, and he stood in the doorway and let her do it, and did not speak. He watched her cross to the centre of the floor, the place, and stand there, and he saw her shoulders rise and lock, and he saw the precise instant the room reached up out of the past and took hold of her breathing gone shallow and quick, her hand groping blind for something to hold. He crossed the room without deciding to. He did not touch her. He stood beside her, close, his shoulder a hand's breadth from hers, near enough that she could feel the warmth of a person there. And he said, very quietly, "I'm here. It's a room. The light's coming in. There's no one in it but us, and I'll stand here as long as you need, and nothing in it can touch you while I'm standing here." She turned and pressed her face into his shoulder. It was not an embrace. Her arms stayed at her sides. She only put her forehead against the wool of his coat and stood there shaking, and he stood very still and let her, his hands hovering and then settling at last, light as two birds inwards against her back. He felt her breathing slow against him by degrees. He felt the shaking ebb. He felt the exact moment the room let go of her, a long exhalation, her whole frame loosening. And he understood that he had given her this, that he had stood in the cursed room and made it ordinary, and that the gift was real, and the man giving it was a liar, and that both of those things were true at once, and would always now be true at once. When she lifted her face, it was very close to his. He had imagined this moment as the design's culmination, had imagined it coldly in December, the kiss that would seal her to him. He had not imagined that when it came, he would have forgotten the design entirely, that he would be standing in the worst room of his life, holding a woman who had walked into her own nightmare on purpose and come out the other side because he was there, that her mouth would be a hand's breadth from his, and her eyes would move from his eyes to his mouth and back, and that the only thing in his entire mind would be the simple, total, undivided wish to close that hand's breadth of April air between them. He did not move. He made himself not move. Because if she crossed it, it would be hers, and if he crossed it, it would be the design's, and he could not. He found, standing there, that he could not bear for it to be the design's. She crossed it. She kissed him in the drawing-room of Malfoy Manor in the long light of an April afternoon. And it was nothing like the kiss he had planned in December. It was slow, and it was careful, and it asked a question rather than took an answer, her mouth soft and uncertain against his, her hand coming up to rest flat against his chest, exactly over the place where the prophecy lay folded in the breast of his coat, so that he kissed her with the parchment of his whole deceit pressed between her palm and his heart, and the irony of it was so total that it would have made him laugh if he had had any laughter left in him, which he did not, because he was too busy being undone. He kissed her back, slowly, carefully. He answered the question her mouth had asked, and the answer was the truest thing he had ever told her, and it was made entirely of silence. They were married in June, in a register office, with 2 witnesses and no announcement, because she did not want her name in the papers, and he did not want his, and because the thing between them had grown so large and so private that the idea of performing it for a crowd was unbearable to them both. Her parents came. Her father shook Draco's hand and looked at him for a long moment with the unhurried assessment of a man who pulls teeth for a living and is not easily frightened, and said only, "She's the best person I know. Mind that you remember it." And Draco said, "I won't be able to forget it," and meant it, and the meaning of it sat in his chest beside the parchment like a coal. The strategist in the back of his mind had gone quiet. It had been going quiet for weeks, drowned out, and there were whole days now when he did not hear it at all, days that began with her hair on the pillow beside him and ended with her voice in the dark recounting some absurdity from the ministry, days so ordinary and so warm that the man who had received an owl in December seemed to belong to a different life, a colder country he had emigrated from and did not intend to visit again. The night of their wedding, in the eastern bedroom of the manor, with the windows open to the June dark and the smell of the garden coming in, the green, the loamy sweetness, the high cold note of a star-clear sky. He undressed her slowly by candlelight and she undressed him, and there was nothing in it of conquest, and nothing in it of design. He had imagined this in December as the instrument's final turn, the cold mechanical heart of the whole scheme. The reality bore no relation to the imagining. The reality was her hands not quite steady at the buttons of his shirt, and his own hands not quite steady either. Was the candlelight moving gold across the curve of her shoulder and the small, fierce scar on her forearm that he kissed, deliberately, first of everything, before he kissed anything else, pressing his mouth to the slur his aunt had carved there, as though he could draw the word back out of her skin and into himself where it belonged? Was her breath catching, not from any practiced touch of his, but from the simple weight of being seen, wholly, by someone who had once seen her as nothing, and now could not see anything else? There was no part of him standing behind his own eyes that night. That was the thing the design had never accounted for, the thing no prophecy could legislate, that a body which has spent months learning another body's breathing cannot, in the end, hold itself separate from it. He had wanted to keep his nature whole and hard inside him, untouched, and merely perform the surrender. But there is no performing this. There is only doing it or not doing it. And when her hands drew him down to her in the candlelight, when she said his name against his mouth the way she had said it that first time in the wine cellar, low and unguarded, and entirely without armor, he did not perform anything at all. He surrendered. He surrendered everything, by inches, and then all at once, the pride and the coldness and the long, cruel architecture of the scheme, all of it given up in the dark of a June night, without his ever deciding to give it, because deciding was no longer something he was able to do where she was concerned. Afterward, she lay against him with her ear over his heart, and he lay awake long after her breathing had gone slow and even, his hand moving without thought through her hair, and he stared at the dark ceiling of the room he had been born to, and he understood the full dimension of what he had done. He had set out to counterfeit a love and walk away with a child, and his pride intact, the prophecy cheated, the surrender faked. And the prophecy had simply waited. It had let him build his clever scheme, and it had let him execute it. And it had known, with the patience of a thing written before any of them were born, that a man cannot live inside the shape of love for half a year without the shape filling, that the counterfeit and the true coin are minted from the same metal, that the surrender of the thing he holds most fiercely would happen exactly as foretold, not despite his scheme, but through it, his scheme the very mechanism of his undoing. He loved her. He lay in the dark with her heartbeat against his ribs, and the prophecy folded in the coat across the chair, and he loved her with a completeness that left no room in him for anything else. And the love was not a victory, it was a catastrophe, because it had arrived too late to make the scheme innocent and too soon to be confessed without destroying her. And he was carrying against his heart a piece of old parchment that said, in iron gall ink gone the colour of rust, that this woman would bear his child, and that the child would be the very thing his deceit had been engineered to produce. She stirred against him, half waking, and murmured something he didn't catch, and her arm tightened across his chest, and Draco Malfoy lay perfectly still beneath the weight of her trust, and her warmth, and her terrible, undeserved happiness. And for the first time in his life, he prayed to nothing, to the dark, to whatever wrote prophecies in the deep places of the ministry, that the parchment was wrong, that the child would not come, that fate would for once be merciful, and let him simply love her without the price he had already, in his coldness, agreed to pay. It was the only prayer he had ever meant. And somewhere below the manor, in the new green of a garden learning to forget its old shape, a peacock cried once into the June dark, and was not answered, and the candle by the bed guttered low and lower, and went out, and left them in a darkness that held, though neither of them yet knew it, the small certain beginning of everything he had asked the night to spare him. She told him in October, on a morning of thin gold light, with a particular shyness he had never seen in her. Hermione Granger, who feared no committee and no curse, made suddenly small and uncertain by the size of the thing she was carrying. They were at breakfast in the small east room they had taken to using, instead of the great dining hall, because the great hall was for the old life, and they had been, all summer, building a new one in the warm corners of the house. She put down her tea. She turned the cup once on its saucer, the gesture he knew, the one that bought her the seconds she needed. And then she looked up at him with her whole heart in her face and said, "I went to the healer on Thursday. I wasn't going to tell you until I was sure. I'm sure now." A breath. "We're going to have a baby, Draco, in the spring." The morning light lay across the table. A blackbird sang in the garden. And Draco Malfoy, who had planned for precisely this moment in a December that now seemed to belong to another man entirely, felt the floor of the world drop away beneath him and felt himself fall, and managed, by an act of will that took the last of everything he had, to keep his face from showing it. Because his first feeling was joy. That was the thing that broke him, sitting at the breakfast table in the gold light. That before the dread, before the prophecy surfaced its iron gall letters in his mind, before any of it, there was one clean second of pure undivided joy. The joy of a man told he is to have a child with the woman he loves. And it was the most honest feeling he had ever had. And it lasted exactly 1 second before the rest of it came down on him, like the roof of a burning house. The heir of Slytherin, from his blood and her body. The thread that may be cut, the heir unmade, if the grey sun cannot master what is in him. And he had not mastered it. He had surrendered it. He had done precisely the thing the prophecy required. He had fallen in love and made a child in tenderness. And so he had not broken the prophecy at all. He had fulfilled it perfectly with the whole of his treacherous heart. Draco? Her face had changed. The shyness was draining out of it, and something frightened was coming in to replace it, because he had said nothing, because his silence had stretched a half-second too long, because she had laid the most precious news of her life on the table between them, and he had received it with a face gone the colour of ash. "Say something. You're frightening me. Are you not—" Her hand found her sleeve cuff. "I thought you'd be. We never talked about. Oh God, you don't want it. You don't want—" No. It came out of him violently, and he reached across the table and seized her hand, the one worrying the cuff, and held it hard. No, Hermione, look at me. I want it. I want it more than I have ever wanted anything in my life, and that is the truth. And you have to believe it is the truth, because everything I am about to tell you will make you doubt it, and you must not doubt this one thing." His voice was shaking. He let it shake. "I want our child. Whatever happens, whatever you decide after, I want it. Hold on to that." After what? She had gone very still. The frightened thing in her face had crystallized into something sharper, the courtroom thing, the thing in her that had survived a war by smelling a lie before it finished forming. Draco. After what? He could have lied. The strategist was long dead, but its grammar remained, and he could have constructed something. A fear of fatherhood, a grief, anything that would have closed her face back into trust and let the morning go on. He looked at her hand in his, at the small scar on her forearm where his aunt's word had healed to silver, at the gold light on the table, and the future she did not yet know was built on a foundation he had laid in cruelty. And he understood that he had reached the one place where the lie could not follow. So he told her, all of it, the owl in December, the parchment, the prophecy which he drew out of his coat where it had lived against his heart for 10 months, and laid on the table beside her cooling tea, and watched her read in the gold light while the blackbirds sang on, oblivious, in the garden. He told her about the scheme. He did not soften it. He had promised himself, somewhere in the telling, that whatever else he did, he would not soften it, would not let her hate him falsely or forgive him falsely, that he owed her at least the clean version of his own cruelty. He told her that he had come to her office in winter not to stop a thief, but to begin a deceit, that he had studied her breathing the way a hunter studies terrain, that he had set out, coldly, by design, to make her love him and to give her a child and to leave. He told her that every true thing he had said to her had been said inside a lie, which made the true things worse and not better. He told her that the love had come anyway, against the design, that it had filled the counterfeit shape until the shape was true, that he loved her now with everything in him, and that he understood, even as he said it, that the love arriving late did not redeem the scheme, that she had every right to hear his love as merely the last and cleverest move of a man who had been playing her from the first hour. She did not interrupt. She read the prophecy twice. He saw her read it twice, the way she read everything, her finger moving once along the iron gall lines. And when she finally looked up, her face was not what he had braced for. He had braced for fury. He had braced for tears. What he saw instead was worse than either. A terrible, dawning, retrospective clarity. The look of a person watching the whole of the past year rearrange itself behind them into a different shape, every warm moment recolored, every kindness now suspect, the wine cellar and the drawing room and the June night all turning over in the new light to show their cold reverse. "The audit," she said. Her voice was very quiet and very even, which was far worse than shouting. "The thief in the resettlement fund, was that real, or did you build it?" It was real. His own voice was wrecked. "I swear to you, that was real. I found it. But you used it." She was nodding slowly to herself, fitting the pieces. "You found a real injustice, and you used it as a door. because you knew I couldn't walk past an injustice. You knew that about me, and you used it. Her hand came up to her mouth. The drawing room. When you stood beside me in the room, your aunt, you knew I'd never let anyone else take me in there. You knew it would. She stopped. Her eyes had filled, and the tears spilled, and she did not wipe them, exactly as she had not wiped them in the wine cellar, and the echo of that night between them now was unbearable. You held me in the worst room of my life, and I thought it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me. And it was a move. It was all moves. The honesty was a move. You told me you were a coward in that wine cellar, and I thought it was the bravest, most honest thing, and it was strategy. You'd worked out that honesty was the one thing I wouldn't expect from a Malfoy. Yes. He would not deny it. He had promised himself he would not deny one true accusation, and every word she was saying was true. Yes, all of it. That's what I did. That's what I am. I won't tell you it wasn't, because you'd hear it and you'd be right. Stop agreeing with me. It tore out of her finally, the first crack in the terrible evenness, and she was on her feet, the chair scraping back, her hand pressed flat to her stomach, in a gesture so instinctive and so protective that it broke something in him to see it. Stop being honest about your dishonesty. It's the cruelest thing you do. It's the thing that made me... She choked on it. How am I supposed to hate you when you won't even let me make you the villain cleanly? You sit there and you confess, and you say you love me with your whole... And I can't tell. Don't you understand? That's what you've done to me. I can't tell anymore which Draco is real, the one who schemed or the one who... Both, he said, and stood, and did not approach her, kept the whole length of the table between them, because he had lost the right to close it. That's the answer, and it's the worst answer, and it's the true one. Both are real. The one who schemed is real, and the one who loves you is real, and they are the same man, and I cannot give you one without the other, because there is only one of me, and he is a man who did a monstrous thing, and then fell so completely in love with the woman he was wronging that the wrong became the worst grief of his life. I am not asking you to forgive it. I am telling you it is true. The prophecy said I could break it by mastering myself, by refusing to surrender, and I thought I could cheat that. I thought I could fake the surrender and keep myself cold and walk away. And instead, I surrendered everything. Really? All of it? You have all of it. You've had all of it since the drawing room, and I have been too much a coward to tell you, because telling you meant this, meant your face looking at me the way it is looking at me now. Don't. She had her hand up, and she was backing toward the door, and her face was streaming, and her other hand was still pressed flat and fierce over the child, their child, the heir the prophecy had promised. And Draco stood frozen at the far end of the table, because he understood that anything he did now, any step toward her, would be one more move in a game she could no longer trust him not to be playing. Don't come near me. Don't. I have to think. I have to think. And I can't think with you in the room, because I can't tell anymore whether I'm thinking or whether you're... She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. I trusted you. I let you take me into that room. I let you... Her eyes went to the prophecy lying on the table in the gold morning light, the iron gall ink, the verdict written before any of them were born. Our daughter is the heir of Slytherin. You made her on purpose. You made her who I already... The hand on her stomach pressed harder. And you were going to leave us. I'm not going to leave you, he said, and his voice broke fully on it. I will never leave you. Do you hear me? The man who was going to leave you died in a wine cellar in February, and you killed him, and I have never in my life been so grateful to be. But she was already at the door, already turning the handle, already gone from the warm east room into the cold of the great house. And Draco Malfoy stood alone at the breakfast table in the thin October light, with the prophecy spilled across the wood beside 2 cups of tea gone stone cold, and the blackbirds singing on and on in the garden as though nothing in the world had ended. And he did not follow her, because following her was the last thing in the world he had any right to do. And the not following was the hardest and the only true thing he had left to give her. She was gone before the first frost. He did not see her go. That was the cruelty he had built for himself and could not unbuild. That he had given her, by his confession, every reason in the world to vanish without a word. And that a woman as clever as Hermione Granger, when she decided to disappear, would leave no thread for anyone to follow, least of all the man she was disappearing from. He came down on a grey morning 3 days after the breakfast table to find the East Room cold and the manor wrong, in the way a house is wrong when a person has left it for good. Some subtraction in the air, some change in the quality of the silence. Her things were gone from the bedroom, not in disarray, not flung, packed with the methodical care of a person who had thought it through. On his pillow, where his head would lie, she had left a single sheet of parchment, and his hands shook so badly opening it that he tore the corner. "I can't tell which of you is real," she had written, in the small, fierce hand he knew from 100 shared ledgers. "That's the thing you took from me. Not my trust, my judgment. I have always been able to read people, and you have made me unable to read you. And I can't raise a child inside a question that large. So I'm taking her where the question can't follow. Don't look for us. If you love me the way you say you do, prove it by the one thing you can. Let us go. H. He read it standing in the cold bedroom in his shirt sleeves, and then he read it again, and then he sat down on the edge of the bed they had shared, and held the parchment in both hands, and did not move for a very long time, while the grey morning brightened and dimmed and brightened again in the windows. He did not let her go. He told himself afterward that he had tried, that for the first weeks he had honoured the letter, had sat in the dead house and let the loss work through him like a slow poison, had told himself that love meant releasing her. But it was not true. Within a fortnight, he was at the ministry, in the records hall where he had first watched her on a ladder with a quill crosswise in her teeth, calling in every favour the Malfoy name could still command, and a great many it could not. He traced the International Flu Registry. He traced the Portkey manifests. He paid a man in the Department of Magical Transportation more galleons than the man had ever seen to comb the records of every authorized departure in the relevant week. And the man came back, pale, and said that there was nothing, that wherever Mrs. Malfoy had gone, she had gone by means that left no manifest. which meant Muggle means, which meant she had walked out of the magical world entirely and into the one country he had no map of, the vast Muggle ocean of her childhood, where a Malfoy could not follow, because a Malfoy did not know how to swim. She had gone home. Not to her parents. He checked. He watched their house for a shameful week. She never came, and her parents looked through him on the doorstep as though he were a pane of glass with nothing behind it, and her father, who pulled teeth and was not easily frightened, said only, "She told us you'd come. She told us not to tell you anything, and she was right, and I'd thank you not to come again," and shut the door. She had gone home to the Muggle world, the country she had ordered wine in so easily that February night, the country he had despised without ever entering. And somewhere in its 100 million strangers, she had taken their daughter and dissolved like salt in the sea. He searched for 2 years. He would not, afterward, be able to give a coherent account of those 2 years. They had the texture of fever. He learned things a Malfoy was never meant to learn. How Muggle records worked, what a passport was, the Byzantine machinery by which Muggles tracked and lost each other, the existence of an entire ocean of paper through which a clever woman could move unseen if she understood it, and he did not. He hired Muggle investigators and could not explain to them what he was really looking for. He stood in the rain outside addresses that turned out to be wrong, in cities whose names his father would have spat. He grew thin. He stopped sleeping. The manor, the great cold house, he closed room by room until he was living in 2 chambers and the rest of it stood shuttered and silent, the portraits sleeping behind dust sheets, the peacocks gone wild and then gone entirely. And slowly, across those 2 years, a change worked in him that the searching itself could not account for. Because he found in the searching that he no longer despised the world he was searching through. He had set out into the Muggle world as into enemy territory, and he had found in it her childhood, the small, ordinary kindnesses of strangers, the dentist's office where her father had worked, the library with the children's section where a clever little girl had surely once sat, reading far above her years. The whole texture of a life lived without magic that was not lesser, that he could find nothing in to despise, that had made the woman he loved exactly what she was. He had despised it because his father had despised it. He had never examined it. And now, looking for her in it, he came to know it, and to know it was to lose the last of the thing the prophecy had asked him to master, the thing he had thought he could keep hard and whole inside himself, the hatred, the certainty of his own blood superiority, the cold inheritance of the grey line. It did not survive contact with the truth. It had never had anything underneath it but a child's fear of his father, and the father was dead, and the fear had nothing left to feed on. He did not find her. That was the thing he had to learn, the hardest thing, learned by inches across 2 years of failing. He was not going to find her. She was cleverer than he was. He had always known it and conceded it to the fire. And a woman cleverer than you, who does not want to be found, will not be found. Not by all the galleons in a disgraced fortune, not by all the love in a converted heart. She had asked him to prove he loved her by letting her go, and he had failed that test for 2 years, and the failing had taught him at last why it had been the right test. because the searching had been for him, his need, his grief, his inability to bear what he had done. And not once, in 2 years, had it been for her. She had asked for peace. He had given her pursuit. And somewhere in the second winter, standing in the rain outside another wrong address in another grey foreign city, Draco Malfoy understood that the only gift he had left to give the woman he loved was the gift of his absence, and that he had been too much a coward to give it, exactly as he had been too much a coward against the wall when they were 16, and that he was being asked one last time to stop being that boy. He stopped searching. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, and it was the first wholly unselfish thing. And he understood the two facts were not unrelated. He came home to the shuttered manor, and he opened the windows, one by one, and let the cold air into the dead rooms. And he sat down in the eastern study where the owl had first struck the glass 2 years before. And he tried to imagine a life that was not organized entirely around a search that would never succeed. And he found that he could not. A man cannot live for nothing. He had lived for the search. Before that, for her. Before that, for a scheme. Before that, for a war he had not believed in. Before that, for a father's approval that had been poison. He had never once in his life lived for something he had chosen, freely, because it was good. He sat in the cold study, and he asked himself the question he had spent 26 years avoiding. What do you actually want, Draco Malfoy? And the answer, when it came, surprised him with its smallness and its clarity. He wanted to be near his daughter. He would never raise her. He had forfeited that. Hermione had been right to take her, and he would not undo it even if he could. But the child would be magical. The prophecy had promised it. And for once he wanted the prophecy to be right. And a magical child born in England, wherever in the wide Muggle world her mother hid her, would, in 11 years, receive a letter. And the letter would bring her to one place, the one place every magical child in Britain came to, the one place even Hermione Granger could not hide her from forever without cutting her off from the world she belonged to. She would come to Hogwarts, and if he were there when she came, not as a father, not as anyone with a claim, but simply as a man who had earned, by years of work, the right to stand in those halls, then he might see her, once, across a great hall. He might know her face. He might, for whatever years she studied there, be near enough to do the one thing he had never managed in his life, to protect a child instead of standing against a wall while she was harmed. It was a long sentence he was proposing to serve. 11 years before she would even come, and then 7 more of seeing her without being allowed to be known to her, of being to his own daughter merely a teacher among teachers. It was the longest, slowest, most uncertain act of penance a man could design, and it asked everything of him and promised almost nothing, and that was precisely why he chose it, because he had learned at last that the things worth doing are not the ones that promise return. He went to Minerva McGonagall in the spring, in her office at the top of the school, and he stood before the woman who had taught him as a boy and watched him become something shameful. And he asked her, without excuse, without the family name, without anything but the plain fact of what he wanted, for the chance to earn a place teaching the one subject he understood from the inside, the defense against the dark things, having been one of them, and come back. She looked at him for a long time over her spectacles, the way her father had once looked at him on a doorstep, the unhurried assessment of someone not easily fooled. And whatever she saw in the thin, sleepless, transformed man before her, it was not the boy she remembered, because at the end of the long silence she said only, "It is the hardest house to teach in, Mr. Malfoy, for a man with your history. The children will know what you were. You will have to earn them one by one, and some you will never earn." A pause. "I find I am willing to let you try. God knows the subject has eaten enough teachers. Perhaps it wants one who has already been to the bottom of it and climbed back." And she stood, and she offered him her hand, and Draco Malfoy took the hand of the woman whose school his family had helped to nearly destroy, and began the only road home he had left, the long road of 11 years, paved with the single fragile hope that at the end of it, across a crowded hall on a September evening, he might look up and see his daughter's face for the first time, and know it, and be allowed at last to keep her safe. The letter came to a narrow house on a tree-lined street in a New England town, where the autumns burned red and the winters came down white and clean off the lake, and where a woman known to her neighbours as Jean Granger had built, across 11 careful years, a life so ordinary that no one in it would ever have believed the truth of where she'd come from. She had chosen the name on purpose, her own middle name, worn now as a first, a small true thing to stand on in a world of necessary fictions. She taught at the local university, medieval law of all things, which her colleagues found charmingly arcane and which suited her exactly, a discipline of old statutes and careful reading where her particular genius could pass for mere diligence. She had a garden. She had a circle of friends who knew nothing. And she had a daughter. Lyra was 11 that autumn, and she was the whole of Hermione's heart walking around outside her body. And she was, there was no use pretending otherwise, strange, in the way Hermione had braced herself for from the first hour. Things happened around Lyra. Cups slid. A bully in the 3rd grade had found his shoelaces knotted together by no hand anyone saw, and had not bothered Lyra again. Books opened to the page she wanted. Hermione had watched it all with a private dread and a private, treacherous wonder, and had said nothing, and had waited the way she had taught herself to wait, for the letter she knew must come. She had spent 11 years preparing the speech she would give when it did. She had it word for word. "You're a witch, my love. So am I. There's a whole world, and I left it to keep you safe, and now you're old enough to know." She had imagined the moment 1,000 times, and in every version she was calm. She was not calm. The owl came at dusk on a Tuesday, a tawny owl, storm-feathered, with eyes like 2 drops of amber, and Hermione stood in her ordinary American kitchen with her ordinary American mug of tea, and watched it land on the windowsill among the late chrysanthemums, and 11 years fell away beneath her like a trapdoor. The envelope bore the seal she had not seen in over a decade. The green ink, the address spelled out in full, Miss L. Granger, the small bedroom, 14 Linden Street. They always knew the room. They had always known the exact room, the magic of it precise and absolute, and reaching all the way across an ocean she had crossed precisely to escape its reach. She gave the speech. It came out nothing like the version she'd rehearsed. It came out broken and tearful and interrupted by her daughter's questions, which were not the questions she'd prepared for. Lyra did not ask, "Am I safe or are you serious?" Lyra asked, with the relentless, practical brilliance that was so exactly her mother's that it took Hermione's breath. "If you're a witch and you went to a magic school in England, then why are we here? What were you hiding from?" And Hermione, who had built 11 years on the foundation of never answering that question, looked at her daughter's face and could not, in the end, lie to it. She did not tell all of it. She would not put the prophecy on a child. But she told her there had been a father in England, and that he had done something that had made it impossible to stay, and that the something had been about Lyra herself before she was born, and that they had come to America so that a certain bad thing that had been predicted could not come true. And she watched her daughter absorb this with the terrible composure of clever children and braced for grief, and got instead a question that pierced her clean through. "Did you love him?" The chrysanthemums stirred in the dusk. The owl waited on the sill. "Yes," Hermione said, because she had promised herself in the kitchen that whatever else she did, she would not teach her daughter that love was a thing to be ashamed of. "Yes, I loved him very much. That was the worst part. It would have been so much easier if I hadn't." The prophecy did not come true. That was the thought Hermione held to across the frantic months of preparation. The international transfer that McGonagall's office arranged with a discretion Hermione had not expected and could not entirely account for. The Diagon Alley shopping, done in a hurried single day under a glamour she barely needed after 11 years. The wand that chose Lyra in Ollivander's with a shower of gold sparks that made the old man murmur something about willow and dragon heartstring, and a defender's wood, that one, mark me. The thought that steadied her through all of it was this: the heir of Slytherin will not be made, because I broke it. I took her away. I raised her in a muggle town with muggle kindness and an ordinary garden, and whatever Salazar's blood wanted of her, it will not get it, because I did not let it. The prophecy lost. And the proof came on the 1st of September. In the great hall she had not stood in for 14 years, under the enchanted ceiling she had once read about in a book before she ever saw it, when her daughter, small and fierce and unafraid, chin up exactly the way Hermione's went up before a thing she dreaded, sat on the stool and had the ancient hat lowered onto her wild brown hair. Hermione was not supposed to be in the hall. Parents did not attend the sorting. But McGonagall, with a gentleness that had surprised her in their correspondence, had bent the rule for the witch who had once helped save the school. And Hermione stood in the shadow of the great doors at the back, unseen, her hand pressed flat to her mouth, and watched. The hat took a long time over Lyra, longer than over any other child that night, long enough that the murmuring started, long enough that Hermione's heart climbed into her throat, because she knew what the hat was seeing, the blood of Slytherin's line running quiet and strong in her daughter's veins, the inheritance she had crossed an ocean to deny. The hat sat on Lyra's head and deliberated, and the seconds stretched, and Hermione stood at the back of the hall and prayed the way Draco had once prayed in the dark of a June bedroom, to nothing, to the ceiling full of false stars, not Slytherin, not the serpent. Let it not be true. Let me have won. Gryffindor! The hall erupted. The lion's table roared and hammered its welcome, and Lyra slid off the stool with a grin that split her whole face and ran to her new house. And Hermione Granger stood in the shadow of the doors with both hands over her mouth now, and tears running freely down between her fingers, and the relief that went through her was so total it left her knees unsteady, because it was done. It was over. 11 years had not been for nothing. The prophecy had asked for an heir of Slytherin and had been given, instead, a Gryffindor. Her daughter, her house, her courage, her blood winning out over the cold inheritance of a man she had loved and fled. She did not, in that flooding instant of triumph, look at the staff table. She had been careful not to. She had spent the whole evening with her eyes fixed on her daughter and on nothing else, partly from a mother's hunger and partly from a deeper instinct, an old caution that told her the staff table belonged to the world she had left, and that there might be faces at it she could not afford to see. McGonagall, in the centre, certainly grown older. The half-giant at the end, weeping happily into a tablecloth-sized handkerchief, as he did at every sorting. The rows of teachers she did not know, hired in the years of her exile. It was the cheering that undid her caution. When the hall roared for Lyra, every head at the staff table turned toward the Gryffindor table to see which child had earned such a long deliberation from the hat, and Hermione's gaze, following the sweep of the hall's attention, swept the staff table too, helplessly for half a second, and stopped. There was a man at the far end of the table who had risen halfway out of his chair. He had risen the way a person rises when something has reached into their chest and pulled, involuntary, arrested, half standing with one hand flat on the table to keep himself up. He was thin in a way that years carve into a face, and his hair had the first grey threads at the temple that grey hair finds early in the fair-headed, and he wore the dark robes of a Hogwarts master with a small silver pin at the collar that marked the defence post. And he was not looking at Hermione. He had not seen Hermione, hidden in the shadow of the doors. He was looking at the child, at Lyra, at the small, fierce, grinning girl now wedged among the Gryffindors, with her wild brown hair and her chin that went up before a thing she dreaded. And his face, across the whole length of the crowded golden hall, was the face of a man looking at the only thing he had lived 11 years to see. Hermione's hand closed hard on the cold stone of the doorframe. The hall roared on around her, oblivious, the candles floating and the false stars wheeling overhead, and the noise of it seemed to come from very far away, behind glass, behind water, while she stood frozen in the shadow with her triumph turning to ash in her mouth, because she knew the line of those shoulders, even thinned by years, knew the precise, involuntary way that man rose when something pulled at his heart, had felt that same arrested stillness in him, once across a reading table in a records hall a lifetime ago. And the single thought that filled the whole of her mind, drowning the cheering and the relief and the 11 careful years, was that Draco Malfoy was sitting at the staff table of Hogwarts School, and that he was looking at their daughter as though his heart were breaking and mending at the same time, and that she had crossed an entire ocean to keep this exact thing from ever happening. She found him on the third night because she could not bear to leave before she had, and because he had not come looking for her, and the not coming told her more than any pursuit ever could have. She had stayed in Hogsmeade under the name Gion, in a small room above the inn, telling herself each morning that she would leave that day, and each evening that she would leave the next. She told herself she stayed for Lyra, to be near while the child settled, to be reachable. It was half true. The other half she did not examine, the same way she had once stopped looking for the trap in a ministry records hall, because some part of her had already decided a thing her mind was not ready to be told. He had not come to the inn. He had not sent an owl, though he must have known by the third day that she was there. In a village that small, word travelled, and a man who had spent 11 years learning to watch a school could certainly notice a woman taking a room under a borrowed name. He had done nothing. He had let her be. And on the third night, Hermione understood that this, the not coming, the discipline of his absence, was the proof she had asked for in a letter 11 years ago and had never believed she would receive, and that she had to see him now on her own terms. Or she would spend the rest of her life wondering what the man at the staff table had become. She walked up to the castle in the dark. The autumn night was cold and clean, the stars hard overhead, the smell of wood smoke and frost-touched bracken coming down off the hills, and the castle stood against the sky exactly as it had when she was a girl, lit from within, the windows gold. McGonagall, who missed nothing, had told her where to find him without being asked. He walks the 7th floor corridor most nights. He says the castle settles better when someone's awake in it. I think he simply cannot sleep. He has not been able to in all the years I've known him here. She found him there, alone, in the long corridor with its tall windows full of stars, and he was standing perfectly still at one of them with his back to her, looking out at the dark grounds, and he did not hear her come, and for a moment she only stood and looked at him as she had once looked at him in a records hall a lifetime ago, before he knew she was there. He had become someone else. That was the first thing, and it shook her. The boy against the wall, the cold schemer at the breakfast table, those were gone, worn away, replaced by this thin, grey-templed man standing watch over a sleeping castle in the small hours because he could not rest. There was a stillness in him now that had weight to it, the same weight she had earned in her own years of careful exile, the stillness of a person who has stopped expecting the world to give them anything and has decided to be good anyway, quietly, for no reward. "She's a Gryffindor," Hermione said. He went rigid. He did not turn at once. She watched his hand find the stone of the window ledge and grip it, the knuckles whitening, and she knew that gesture. She had catalogued it years ago across 1,000 shared ledgers. The thing his hands did when something had struck too deep for his face to be trusted, and the recognition of it went through her like a wire drawn tight. "Yes," he said, to the window, to the stars. His voice was lower than she remembered, roughened by years. "I was there. I saw." A long pause, and his grip on the ledge did not ease. The hat took so long. I thought, for the length of it, I thought it was going to say the other thing, and then it didn't. And I have spent 3 days trying to understand why a man should weep with relief to hear that his own blood was not good enough for the house his family bled for. And I find the answer is very simple, and I should have known it 11 years ago. Now he turned. His eyes found her in the dark corridor, and there was no scheme in them, nothing held back, nothing behind them watching from a cold remove, only a man looking at the thing he had lost and not dared hope to see. It's because she's yours. The hat saw what you put in her. 11 years of you, and an ocean between her and everything I am, and it looked at all of that, and it called her a Gryffindor, and the prophecy lost Hermione. You broke it. You did the thing I was too much a coward and too much a fool to do. You mastered what was in me when I couldn't, by simply taking her away from it and raising her good. Don't. Her hand had found her sleeve cuff, the old gesture worrying the button, and she made herself stop it, made herself stand still. Don't make me the hero of your story. I didn't break the prophecy out of nobility. I ran. I was terrified, and I ran, and I built a whole life out of running, and I told myself every day for 11 years that I'd won, that I'd beaten it, that I'd beaten you. Her voice cracked, and then I stood in the back of that hall, and I watched you stand up halfway out of your chair to look at her, and I realized I hadn't beaten anything. I'd just been hiding from a man who, it turns out, has spent 11 years standing watch over a school in the dark because he couldn't sleep, who never once came looking for me when I came back, who taught the hardest subject in the worst house because... She stopped. McGonagall told me why you came here. She said you asked for the post with nothing, no family name, no excuse. She said you've spent 11 years earning the children one by one. Why? Why this? Why here? You know why. It was barely above a whisper. It was the only road that led to her. I knew she'd come here eventually. Every magical child in Britain does. You couldn't keep her from it forever without cutting her off from her own self. And you would never do that to her. You love her too well. So I came here, and I waited, and I made myself into a man who deserved to stand in the same hall as her. I never meant to find you. I'd given that up. You asked me to let you go, and it took me 2 years, and it nearly killed me. But I learned how. I came here for the chance of seeing her face once, across a room, and being near enough to keep her safe, which is the one thing I failed to do for you when we were 16, and I have wanted to do for someone, anyone, every day since. His grip on the ledge finally eased, and his hand fell to his side, and he looked suddenly unbearably tired and unbearably young. I wasn't going to introduce myself to her. I want you to know that. I'd decided. She has a life and a mother who gave up everything for her, and she doesn't need a stranger appearing to tell her his blood made a prophecy. I was going to be a teacher to her, and nothing more, for 7 years, and let that be enough, because it's more than I had any right to. The corridor was very quiet. The stars wheeled in the tall windows. Somewhere far below, the castle settled with a long wooden sigh, the way old houses do, and Hermione Granger stood in the dark, and felt the last of the architecture of her 11 years come down around her, beam by beam, because she had built all of it on the certainty that the man she fled was a man who took. And she was looking now at a man who had spent over a decade learning, with terrible patience, only how to give. "She asked me if I loved you," she said. The words came out before she had decided to say them. When the letter came, she asked, "Did you love him?" And I told her yes, because I wouldn't teach her to be ashamed of love. And she looked at me. She has your way of looking. Did you know that? The same. She looked at me and she said, "Then why are you sad about it?" And I didn't have an answer. I've had 3 days to find one, and I still don't, except... Her voice gave way entirely. Except that I never stopped. That's the answer. I crossed an ocean and I built a whole false life, and I changed my name, and I raised our daughter 11 years without you, and I never, for one single day, stopped, and I have hated you for that more than I hated you for any of the rest of it, because the scheming I could leave behind, I could pack that in a trunk, but I could not pack this. I have carried it the whole way and back." He crossed the corridor. He did it the way he had once crossed her office floor, without deciding to, the distance simply gone, and he stopped close in front of her, close enough that she could see the grey threads at his temple and the lines years had drawn, close enough to feel the warmth of a person standing there in the cold stone dark, and he did not touch her. He kept his hands at his sides. He had learned that, too, that the closing of distance had to be hers, every inch of it, or it was a thing taken instead of a thing given, and he would not now, not ever again, take anything from her that she did not freely cross the distance to give. "I'm not the man who schemed," he said, very low. "I'm not asking you to believe that on my word, because my word is the thing I broke. I'm asking you to look at 11 years of a man choosing, every day, to do the hard, good thing for no reward, and to decide for yourself, the way you decide everything, by reading the evidence, which you do better than anyone alive. That's all I have to offer you, not a promise. Evidence. Look at it and tell me what you find." She looked at him. She looked at him the way she had once read a forged document she suspected, slow and frank and unsparing, and she read the thinness of him and the grey at his temples and the sleeplessness worn into his face and the 11 years standing watch over a school in the dark. And she read the hands held carefully at his sides, and she read the fact that he had not come for her, had let her be, had given her the one thing she'd asked for, even when it cost him everything. And she found, reading all of it, that the question that had kept her awake for 11 years, the question of which Draco was real, had finally, quietly answered itself. Both had been real. He had told her that at the breakfast table, and she had hated him for it, the cruelty of the true answer. But the schemer had needed feeding, by fear, by his father, by the cold inheritance of the grey line. And across 11 years she had watched, from an ocean away and now from a foot away, that man slowly starved to death for lack of anything to feed him, until all that was left was the other one, the one who loved her, standing alone in a corridor full of stars with his hands at his sides, waiting for her to read the evidence and decide. She crossed the distance. She reached up and took his thin face in both her hands, the way she had wanted to in a wine cellar a lifetime ago, and had gripped the table to stop herself. and she felt him go utterly still under her palms, felt his breath catch the way she had once learned to anticipate across a shared desk, and she drew his face down to hers, and she kissed him. It was not the careful, questioning kiss of a manor drawing room in a vanished April. There was no question left in it. It was 11 years long, and it tasted of frost and of wood smoke and of every night of an ocean's distance, and his hands came up at last from his sides and found her back and held her as though she were the only solid thing in a world made entirely of stars. And she felt him shaking, felt the wetness on his face that was not hers. And she did not stop, and he did not stop. And the castle settled and sighed around them in the dark, and the false stars wheeled in the tall windows, and somewhere 2 floors below their daughter slept, a Gryffindor, safe, the prophecy broken and undone, and turned into nothing but the strange story of how her parents found their way back to each other. When they finally drew apart, it was only far enough to rest his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard in the cold air, and he said her name once, just her name, Hermione, the way he had said it the first time in a Muggle wine cellar, with the candle burned to a stub, low and unguarded, and made entirely of everything he had never been able to say. And she laughed, wetly, the way she had laughed that night, disbelievingly, at the most insulting possible outcome. That after everything, after the scheme and the flight and the ocean and the 11 years, she should be standing in a corridor at Hogwarts, with her face in the hands of Draco Malfoy, home at last, in the one place she had crossed the whole world to escape. "She has your way of looking," Hermione said against his mouth. "You should meet her properly, not as her teacher, as whatever we decide you are. We'll work it out the way we worked out the amendment. Narrow, not broad. 1 clause at a time." 1 clause at a time, he agreed. And she felt him smile against her, the first true smile she had felt from him in 11 years. And outside the tall windows, the autumn stars burned on over the sleeping castle and the dark hills and the long, slow, impossible road that had brought them, against every prophecy ever written, all the way back home.
So that's the end of today's story. Thank you for staying with me. I want to tell you why I wrote it. Draco started with a cold plan. He thought he could fake love. He thought he could give nothing of himself and still get what he wanted. He was wrong. There is a moment I keep thinking about. He is sitting on the floor of her office late at night. A piece of her hair falls into her eyes, and without thinking, he reaches out and tucks it behind her ear. It was not part of his plan. His own hand surprised him. That small moment is the whole story for me, because that is how real feeling works. It does not ask for permission, it just arrives. I believe people can change, not with big speeches, with small quiet choices made every day for years when no one is watching. Draco did not earn her back with words, he earned her back with time, and Hermione was brave. She ran to protect her child. That is not weakness, that is love. If you take one thing from this story, take this. The mask you wear can become your real face, so be careful what you pretend to be, and never give up on a person who is truly trying to change. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart. I will see you in the next story.